G'day and welcome to another episode of Built by Dan. In today's episode, we're going to be tackling part 2 or part B of the steering rack and steering column install. So as you saw in the last episode, I didn't quite get it all finished, had a few issues that required a little bit more work than anticipated. So I managed to get the steering rack bracket installed, the elongated holes cut for the steering arms to pass through, and the steering column installed. So in this episode, I'll be installing the steering rack and doing the final connection between the steering rack and steering column. Okay, so I almost got a bit carried away there with the steering rack and forgot that I wanted to install these corner brackets in the rear footwell. Basically, because they have an opening that goes to the wheel well, they are susceptible to get some moisture or some rain or some water spray from the tyres coming up and into the inside of this. So, provided with a couple of caps that can sit on the bottom, I just need to trim the fins off. I'll silicone them in to make them nice and watertight. As you can see there, the end cap is 50mm by 50mm, but the size of this piece is about 50mm by 45mm. So I will have to trim down one side once I'm done, just to make that fit, and I'll just line it, nice thick bit of silicone to seal it off. Now when I install these, they've obviously got 5 bolts each side, but I also need to run a bead of silicone along each of those sides, those faces that marry up to the wall of the footwell to keep it all nice and watertight. So I've got 2 sides trimmed down now just so it sits nicely. And I just need to shave off the excess on this one side. So there we go. Trim down that one side that was too long. By trimming off the fins, I get a nice overlap at the end of that, and I can silicone it all on to keep it nice and watertight. I'll do the same for the other side, and then I'll stick them on and bolt them up. Okay, so it was near on impossible to film the install of these brackets. There's just nowhere to put the camera without blocking its view, but this is basically what they look like now that they're installed. You can see there is a bit of silicone around the place, but once we actually line the interior with carpet, no one would know any different. So that's it. Now we can move on to installing the steering rack. Okay, so now I'm going to look at installing the steering rack. Again, it's a real pokey area that's hard to sort of get a good view with the camera. So I'll do my best. I think this front view is probably going to give the best view. Just going to feed the steering rack down through the opening in the top. I've wound it all the way to one end, to the passenger side. There we go, just slid in there. So before I go too much further, I'm just going to try and wind that steering rack back to more of a central position. I'll grab my bolts and try and get them held in place. It looks like I may just need to trim the top of this hole a little bit to get it to sit nicely. I'll just try and get those front bolts and spacers in and see how it sits. It might just be falling forwards that little bit. Yeah, it's definitely still clashing with something. Okay, want to go and have a look from inside the footwell and see what we can see in there. Okay, so this is inside the footwell. It does look like it might be hitting on the bottom as well as the top, so I may need to enlarge that hole a little bit. Okay, so I've played around with it a bit more, but I just can't seem to get it to work. It's hitting just on top here, that just raises up a little bit in the middle on the housing on the steering rack. So I'm going to get the file out and just try and take that little bit off, even if I can just chamfer that edge so that it just gives a little bit more clearance in the front. And I might do the same on the bottom. There is just a little rib that sits underneath that housing that seems to be just touching the bottom as well. So I'll give that a go, and then I'll try refitting or retest fitting the steering rack. We'll clean that up and we'll try test fitting the steering rack once again. Alright, so now that I've shaved that back and cleaned that up, I'm just going to try and test fit the steering rack once more. I'll try a different angle this time, might be able to see it a bit better, but as you can see, I've wound the steering rack all the way to one end. That just gives me enough room to be able to feed it through into the chassis. I feed the steering shaft into the footwell wall first, and then I can just squeeze the other steering arm through the hole. Once again, I'm just going to try and even out that rack a little bit. Looks like it might protrude through just a little bit more, but obviously that's not sitting on its spacers yet. So let's see how we go installing it on the spacers. So all I've done is just sit the bolts for the forwardmost fixings, and now I'll put the bolts in for the rear fixings, where I've shaved them down to clear the heads of the mounting bracket bolts. That all seems to sit a lot nicer. You can actually see just that little bit of light all the way around the steering rack housing, which would suggest that we're no longer sitting on the chassis, or the chassis cutout I should say. Okay, I'm relatively happy with that. I'll show you how that looks before I bolt it up, and then I'll fix the nuts onto the back of those bolts. So there it is, the steering rack is just sitting there. The bolts have been passed through the mounting holes and the mounting bosses. can just see them in behind there, clearing the bolt head. And underneath there at the front, a bit hard to get it to focus. But there's our steering arm sticking out of both sides. And again, if I move that up out of the way, we can see in there our two mounting bosses and the bolts just sticking through the bracket there. So it's near on impossible to actually capture what I was doing, but it's quite awkward. I just had to bend these steering arms up as far as they would go to be able to get my hand in through here. It's a bit of a squeeze, but just enough to be able to hold those nuts, get a spanner in there, and then just a socket on top to tighten them. Same for the other side. Not really any easier. So that's the steering rack fitted. Now it's just a matter of marrying that up to the steering column. So I have already installed the steering column, but I did uninstall it. If you remember when I installed it, this front bearing was quite loose. So what I did, noting that it sat quite high, I just put an extra spacer in there. It needed a couple of washers, or at least one more washer, because the shaft of the bolt, the unthreaded shaft, was obviously too long. So I've put the extra mounting boss spacer in there. That'll lower the angle of the steering rack, and it solves my problem with the wobbly bearing. Now what I'm going to do is just fit off this union joint onto the end of the steering rack, and then as I position this into place, connect the other end onto the input shaft of the steering rack. Now you can probably see this better on camera than I can from where I am, but I'm just going to try and slide or connect these on there. Okay, so that's telling me that we are too long and that's not going to bolt up. It's a good test fit at least, but I think I might need to adjust it so that I can slide the steering rack further into that union joint, so that I can actually get this bracket to mount up properly. Let's grab the camera and I'll give you a quick look as to what I'm seeing from my end. Okay, so this is what I was seeing at my end. With the input shaft of the steering rack fully inserted into that union joint, I still have about 1 centimetre gap here between the bracket and the chassis. So I need to be able to insert that further. I think the only way I'm going to achieve that is by shaving back a bit more of the steering column here, so that it can actually insert further into that join. So just to give a slightly better explanation as to what I was talking about, when I originally shaved down this steering column to be able to fit into the connection, I probably took a bit of a conservative approach. So you can see how much I've shaved back versus how much is actually shaved back on the shaft of the steering rack. So I went and measured the steering rack, it's about 1 1/4 inch. So I've now marked that on all 4 sides of the steering column, and I'll now take that to the grinding wheel and grind that back to the same distance. That should allow me to feed in basically that extra centimetre that I needed, and should allow me then bolt up the bracket as it was before I tried to connect it to the steering rack. Okay, so I've ground back a lot further now. I'd rather go a little bit too far than not enough again. And as you can see, I've installed it so that I've just got enough clearance, if this had to go full lock, that it wouldn't actually hit and obstruct, or the steering column wouldn't hit and obstruct the union joint from turning as it should. I don't think I'll need it to go full lock, but I'd rather install it like this to start with, and if I still need to mess around with it, then I can look at potentially pushing the rod in further, just depending on how it all sits in the car. But it was easier to install that one end to the right length, or inserted to the right depth, before I tried to put it on the car. Okay, so test fit number 2. That sits much better, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that off. It probably needs a little bit more adjustment, so I'll have to extend the steering column a little bit further into the join just for it to sit flush, but it's only about 1 millimeter, so I think we can compromise 1 more millimeter without any issues. We'll give it a go, and then I'll play around with it a bit just to make sure that I do have full ability to turn that steering column and steering rack without it binding. Okay, so a small problem I'm finding now that I'm trying to fit off this steering column bracket is that I've got obviously my steering column connected to the steering shaft. I've got my bolts in at the front where it mounts into the chassis, but at the back here I can fit my finger there between the bracket and this sort of top sheeting of the dash panel, so the chassis panel, and obviously that's not good. This should be hard up against it. So I think what my problem is that I've just made some assumptions on what spacers I should use. So the spacers I'm referring to are these ones here. So I just pointed out earlier how I'd put in the extra spacer at the front here because I didn't have enough thread on the bolt to tighten it up all the way just with the single spacer at the top, and then obviously this single spacer at the back here. So what I'm going to have to do is either look to reduce the front and maybe, like I said, just go back to putting an extra washer in there to get the nut to tighten up tight on the bolt, and look to put some additional spacers at the back here so that I can actually lift the bracket up, because obviously the bearing has to stay at that point. So I'll play around with a few different spacers. I'll undo the bolts and just see what's going to work, and I'll come back once I've worked out which combination of spacers is going to work best. Okay, so after a bit of stuffing around, I found that the combination that worked is a 6 and a 9 mil on the far side, and on this side I've got a 9, a 3, and then about a 1.5 mil washer. It wasn't quite enough there for another 3 mil or for the 6 mil overall, so that's what works. I've bolted everything off now. Still got some good movement in the steering column, so I'm going to leave it like that for now. I may need to come back to it later on in the build if the steering column is not sitting at the right height for the steering wheel, and play around with it a little bit more. The back will pretty much have to stay as is or go lower, and the front could potentially have to come lower as well. So we'll just wait and see. For now, it's fitted off, it works. It's not binding, so that's a good start. And like I said, I can come back and revisit it later. So just to recap today's episode and progress so far, we've got the pedal assembly installed. We've got those front corner suspension brackets installed and sealed so they're watertight. We've got the steering column installed and fitted off to the steering rack input shaft. And then if we head around to the front of the vehicle, we've got the remote brake and clutch fluid reservoirs, the steering rack mount bracket and steering rack installed, and then we've got our master cylinders linked to the pedal assembly. So that's all for today's episode and progress so far. Tune in to next episode where we'll tackle the fuel tanks. As you can see, I've already started playing around trying to get them mounted to see how they'll fit, and it looks like there's going to be a bit more fabrication work to cut out some of the chassis to be able to get them to sit nicely. So that's what we'll tackle next episode, and I may look to run the hard tubes through the center tunnel as well for both the cooling and brake and clutch.